everyone. Sorry that I cannot attend class today. This lecture is probably not going to go the full length of the class period. I have something, not COVID, but probably some sort of flu or something going around. Based on the emails, I think a number of students do too, so a good chance I caught it, whatever, at the university. Okay, so today I'm just going to briefly go over some of the Thoreau reading, and then I'm going to spend some time talking about Parable of the Sower. Spoiler alert, I'm going to be talking about, kind of some climatic events that happen in Parable of the Sower, so, if you're not wanting to have some of that spoiled, maybe you can pause the lecture at that point and do some reading and return back to it. So last time I started, I was talking about liberalism, and this now has been sort of the dominant idea, and it's basically under threat across the world by autocratic governments and various illiberal, anti-liberal forces. And it, this raises all sorts of questions in terms of, social and civil rights and things like that. It also raises a lot of questions about the environment. This is something that I've thought about for quite some time. The post-World War II order kind of managed relations between countries and nations and so on, and that appears to be crumbling. I mean, the Russian attack on Ukraine has basically violates everything that was set up in the aftermath of the Second World War. We can say the same thing about many U.S. adventures, like in Iraq and so on. So, I mentioned Thomas Carlyle, an English writer, and just started reading his only fiction, and it's sort of a satire about this professor who was a professor of clothing, and it turns into this critique of industrial society and the emerging industrial society. It might be considered, one of the first transcendental works. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote the foreword or whatever for one of the editions. And Carlyle had a huge influence on John Stuart Mill, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, a lot of the transcendental and liberal thinkers. As I said, he has some kind of authoritarian elements too. What's interesting about him and relevant for this class, he was sort of writing, as I said, maybe the first transcendental work, also maybe one of the last of the Romantic period. So the Romantic period, late 1700s, early 1800s, basically idealizing nature, and at this point it was tied to religion and stuff, and transcendentalism in some ways is kind of like that romanticism of the early 1800s, in that it was kind of exalted nature and was skeptical of industrialization. Sorry, every once in a while I'll probably grab my head. I feel like I've got a fracking operation going on in there. Anyway. So anyway, I've been very interested in this, in some of these discussions about transcendentalism and the role it may play in, trying to come up with a new sort of social system, which appears to be happening around the world, and we're active agents in that, and so our thoughts and our decisions have tremendous influence, more than we realize. I teach social networks in sociology sometime, and social network analysis. And what you find is that, we do have a lot of influence by things we do, where, the research is fascinating. We're actually our happiness can be more influenced by the happiness of a friend rather than something that happens to us in our own lives, because of the network effects and social interaction and how that affects us. So anyway, very, very interesting, I think. So Walden is, it's not like a manifesto for social action or anything like that, clearly. It's solitude, being alone, all of these things. However, he touches upon so many areas that are now sites of social struggle or consciousness. In the readings for this week, it starts with the bean field, where he says, "My enemies are worms, cool days, and most of all, woodchucks." I lived in Pennsylvania for a while, and there's lots of woodchucks there, and groundhogs, and so on. So I know what he is talking about. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, when you are a gardener, and if you're trying to garden in a way that's where you don't use pesticides, where you have an organic garden, pests are going to be a problem. We had a garden when we lived in historic family housing, for example, and every so often there would be pests that would come in and eat things, and someone was telling us you can't grow Brussels sprouts because there's bugs and pests that will eat them. So it just it's impossible. It doesn't happen there. And we grew some Brussels sprouts, and it worked well. And our pesticide was frogs. At that time there was a wetland there. It's pretty dry at the moment, but there were a lot of these little frogs, and they would hang out on the Brussels sprout plant and eat all of the bugs. So we actually were successful. However, nature usually doesn't work that way for people. And, we were not growing for subsistence. We would eat what we got out of there, but most of our food is still coming from the store. That's the case with a lot of people. A lot of people garden and are able to, sustain themselves quite a bit based on what they're able to grow. However, they still often will need to go to the store for, things that they can't grow. Range of different things, meats, maybe dairy, sort of dairy products, stuff like that. Also, most gardens are not big enough to be actual subsistence, for subsistence systems. So, but he's touching upon something that's I think is important. One of the questions I was going to ask, and we can talk about this next week, is have you had a garden in your life? Now, you're relatively young, and chances are maybe you didn't. I pulled a lot of weeds out of the garden, but beyond that, when I was younger, gardening wasn't really on my radar, or I should say my family does a lot of gardening, my extended family, but it wasn't something that I even considered I would be doing. I'll be living in California doing this and that. And we don't have a garden now, but when we were in Pennsylvania, we had an enormous garden for a while, and it was incredibly bountiful and so on. I love the way that he describes things. We've talked about this before, but there's a line where he's talking about the bean field. And he says, "As I drew a still fresher soil about the rows with my hoe, I disturbed the ashes of unchronicled nations, who in primeval years lived under the heavens, and their small implements of war and hunting were brought to the light of this modern day." So I guess he's kind of an archaeologist there, kind of finding things in the ground and so on. I've never, unfortunately, had that happen when I was gardening. He talks about gardening, though, almost like a religious experience. He said it was a singular experience, that long acquaintance which I had cultivated with my beans, that with planting and hoeing and harvesting and threshing and picking over and selling them, the last was the hardest of all, I might add eating, for I did taste. So he actually did try to sell some of his goods. He said that was the hardest thing of all, so probably not very successful. He, another way he talks about it is kind of sort of relating it to Greek mythology. A long war, not with cranes, but with weeds. Those Trojans who had sun and rain and dews on their side. Daily the beans saw me come to their rescue, armed with a hoe, and thin the ranks of their enemies, filling up the trenches with weedy dead. Many a lusty, crest-waving Hector that towered a whole foot above his crowding comrades fell before my weapon and rolled in the dust. Such a an imaginative way to describe weeding. Kind of calling them Trojans, and many a lusty crest-waving Hector, who was a figure in the Greek story, the Iliad, Homer's story, the Iliad. On the next page, he kind of talks about the prices of all these different things, of peas and potatoes and stuff like that. He kind of looks at how much it costs other people, then he compares it to himself, and it's about half as much. He's not using horses, for example. That's a pretty big chunk of the cost, and the main difference between those two. He talks about the village just a little bit. Not, he don't say a whole lot there. And if you remember, he sort of, was kind of critical of village life. He kind of talks about going into the village, and he can't wait till he can go back into the darkness of the forest. And at one point, he talks about what happened to him. He says, one afternoon near the end of the first summer, when I went to the village to get a shoe from the cobblers, I was seized and put into jail. Because, as I have elsewhere related, I did not pay a tax to or recognize the authority of the state which buys and sells men, women, and children like cattle at the door of its Senate house. So he's talking about slavery there, about when he was arrested for refusing to pay taxes because he didn't want to pay taxes to a government that was allowing slavery to happen. And even though slavery is happening in the South, there are plenty of northern industrialists who are using the cotton and using the rice and the various things that are produced with slave labor. And he's arrested for this. Only spends like a day there, but it has a profound impact on him, and for the rest of his life. He's, as I said, kind of libertarian, and he sees the power that the state can have, and that just makes him want to go to the woods even more. I do like his chapter on the ponds. I think that's the last one I'll go over for. That's the last chapter of this week. So shortly after he kind of introduces it, he talks about the scenery of Walden. He says, the scenery of Walden is on a humble scale, and though very beautiful, does not approach grandeur, nor can it much concern one who has not long frequented it or lived by its shore. Yet this pond is so remarkable for its depth and purity as to merit a particular description. It is a clear and deep green well, half a mile long and 1 3/4 miles in circumference. And it goes on to just kind of describe it, but he kind of talks about how it doesn't seem beautiful. It's not like the Great Lakes or the Niagara Falls or something like that. However, he says that when you spend some time really looking at it, it is beautiful, and it is this sort of amazing, a feature of nature. and that's kind of what he's trying to get across, that something that is fairly normal, that most people don't, they're not like huge tourists that are planning vacations at Walden, things like that. Nevertheless, it's kind of like Emerson and the other transcendentalists, and recognizing that there is this beauty in in things, in small things, in things that may seem, just to be sort of typical pedestrian, that sort of thing. Let's see. I think that might be. He talks about lakes. Just later, a few pages later, he says, "A lake is the landscape's most beautiful and expressive feature. It is Earth's eye, looking into which the beholder measures the depth of his own nature. The fluviatile trees next to the shore are the slender eyelashes which fringe it, and the wooded hills and cliffs around it are its overhanging brows." So they're kind of, alluding to a face or something like that. Again, very creative writing about nature. When we read a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, it's that's kind of the way that he writes. He's mostly talking about different animals and things that he sees, and the writing is just beautiful. I mean, it's really kind of incredible. Oh, I did, just since it's in front of me. On the side, I'm reading I don't know if you can see it actually, the original Bambi. So I think I may have mentioned this, but it's the original Bambi is a German book. It was written in the 1920s, and it's actually it's sort of an allusion to the Jewish people at the time, and how they didn't have a feeling of a homeland. And when the mother is shot and killed, that's it's sort of, Bambi is kind of disillusioned, and kind of in the book is depressed and kind of lonely. The word lonely comes up again and again and again. It's very interesting. But it's supposed to again represent this idea that without the mother there, Bambi is, confused on his own, sometimes despairing, and he was using that to write about, as a metaphor for the Jewish people not having a homeland. It's also more, I would say, anti-human perhaps than the Disney movie. Now, the author Felix Salten was a hunter, and was a hunter who had deep respect and reverence for nature and the natural world, and was trying to sort of get this point across, that you can be a hunter and care about nature and the environment as well. So, if you're interested in extremism, I'm reading a book about the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys, how a right-wing street gang ushered in a new era of American extremism. Sort of off topic, but anyway. So, moving on to Chapter of the Sower, we read chapters 9 through 11. I'm just going to, as I said, go over just a few things. It starts out by talking about how all struggles are basically power struggles of one kind or another. So, as I said, this is when the book really starts to pick up and things start happening. One of the most probably important thing that happens is with Lauren's brother. So remember, they live in this gated community where each house has a key for the gate, and each house too has sort of kind of a somewhat elaborate security system. And the brother Keith, there's a few brothers, but Keith is the one they focus on. or she focuses on. So he steals the key, he goes out, he returns, and he's been jumped by a number of other people. He's beaten up, and they've stolen the key. And that's not good, because they could get into the compound and start robbing and stealing. So as punishment, Lauren's father, who is a minister, makes Keith come and confess to the whole church. So this isn't like a confession where he just confessed to the priest in this private box. No, he has to go up in front of everybody and say what he did, and that probably builds some resentment in him. He leaves for a while. He comes back. He's the favorite of the kids of Corey. By Corey, Corey is the mother. Lauren's mother dies during childbirth, so this is Lauren's stepmom. So she, she maintains a relationship with Keith. Keith comes back every so often and, gives them money, gives her money, I should say. Says hi to everyone except the father. Didn't really talk to him. And Keith, it becomes clear that he's getting involved in some sort of criminal activities. He comes back well dressed, and he's got all this money, more money than you can make at a job in that amount of time. And so it's pretty clear that this is criminal behavior that he's engaged in. So for the most part, that's a lot of what chapter 9 is. Then chapter 10, and I think there's right before that, on page 102, it's just one of the quotes from the Earthseed Book of the Living. At the top of the page it says 2026, so that's where they're at now. So civilization is to groups what intelligence is to individuals. It is a means of combining the intelligence of many to achieve ongoing group adaptation. Civilization, like intelligence, may serve well, serve adequately, or fail to serve its adaptive function. When civilization fails to serve, it must disintegrate, unless it is acted upon by unifying internal or external forces. So I think this is important when we talk about groups and intelligence. I was just talking about this in my urban sociology class yesterday. So there was a game, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You'd be asked these questions, and you had a few options. You could, call some friend expert or something and ask them, or you could ask the crowd, the audience in the game. And they would have like a little clicker thing, and they found that the audience, they were right 90% of the time. So does that mean that, bigger groups are always better and always smarter? No, not necessarily. But if you do have a group of people that are relatively, knowledgeable about whatever it is that you're concerned with, then it's good to have that group around. So then, on the next page, there's another great quote. When apparent stability disintegrates, as it must, God is change. People tend to give in to fear and depression, to need and greed, when no influence is strong enough to unify people. They divide, they struggle, one against one, group against group, for survival, position, power. They remember old hates and generate new ones. They create chaos and nurture it. They kill and kill and kill, until they are conquered by outside forces, or until one of them becomes a leader most will follow, or a tyrant most fear. Again, so that's sort of opening up this chapter, where a lot of stuff, as I said, happens. One of the things that's, I think, very relevant then, they're talking, I should say this, Keith comes back and he's talking with Lauren, and Keith has been, beaten by the father several times. Asks if Lauren had ever been hit, and she says yes. When I was 12. And, they're like making out with a boy in the bushes or something like that, and that led to corporal punishment by the father. So Keith also talks about these groups of people that are out there, and there's been just mentioned in the book. He calls them the paints, because sometimes they shave their heads and paint their heads and have these sort of identifying physical features. So there's this drug that makes people just fascinated with fire, and that's in the book. Thankfully, I don't think it exists yet, but it also then causes people to commit arson, because they like the fire, and this will help them help their need to see fire. So here, big spoiler alert. I'll just take that spoiler alert in case you want to finish reading the chapters before this. So then there's kind of a sad line where it's just one line in sort of the diary sort of format, and basically just saying, my mother and father went to identify the body of Keith. So Keith, evidently in his new criminal life outside the compound, had been killed. It looked like his body had been mutilated. He had probably been tortured extensively before he was killed, or maybe was killed in the process. And then it talks about how the community responds. And Lauren, interestingly, she says, I loved my brother, but I also hated him almost the same, and describes him as basically a sociopath. But she says, she really doesn't like the way that he died, and, feels awful that he had been tortured. And then she talks about her hyperempathy syndrome, and how, if everybody had this empathy, heightened empathy, no one would torture, because, you would feel that pain so intensely yourself. Geez, could we figure out some sort of, drug that does that and just give it to the population? I don't think a lot of people wouldn't take it, I think, based upon that. But anyway, we'll get there later. So Lauren says, she didn't cry for him, which, it's her brother, but at the same time, as I said, he says, I wish Dad could cry for his son, but I don't feel any need at all to cry for my brother. May he rest in peace in his urn in heaven, wherever. So basically, wherever whatever happens when you die, whether it's nothingness or up into the supernatural world, she wishes that things get better, or that he is doing better essentially than he did in life. In chapter 11, a few pages into it, well, I should say the first line of chapter 11 is, we are coming apart. The community, families, individual family members, were a rope breaking a single strand at a time. And then she goes on to talk about all these robberies and break-ins into the compound, into people's houses. A 75-year-old grandmother was killed with a crowbar. And there is this, she talks about this company town of Oliver. It's a made-up town. I imagine it would be like around Santa Monica or Malibu, Thousand Oaks, some of these places that are community, or that are kind of commuter suburbs. But it's on the beach, so maybe more Malibu or somewhere. And this company, KSF, comes in, and they want to privatize the city. And so it's put up to a vote, and the people agree with it. So this company, so it's basically this town now that's been privatized by this company. they have a solar power desalinization plant and all these other sort of perks and so on. And Lawrence, says, well, that's all great, but what, it's still, connected to the rest of the country, the nation, the state, the cities, and so on. So it's not like it's going to be this island of stability forever, because, it's just the way that things tend to work. So very interesting. I have a lot to say about privatization in cities, but I think I'll wait till next week when I'm a bit more clear-headed to go into that. So she goes on. This is Saturday, October 24th, 2026. So 4 years from now. Almost exactly, but not quite. So essentially, a few paragraphs down, she's talking about, the apocalypse, or, Armageddon, whatever you want to call it, the big cataclysmic event that's just happened and, destroys society, and society has to rebuild. She says, I've changed my mind. I used to wait for the explosion, the big crash, the sudden chaos that would destroy the neighborhood. Instead, things are unraveling, disintegrating bit by bit. I think that's a very important line, and important sentiment that she's expressing. So I think it's very important, because I think movies and maybe books too have kind of painted this picture like there's going to be an alien invasion, or there's going to be some event that happens that society falls apart. We don't really talk about things that what actually happens during the collapse of societies. It's not so quick and chaotic. I mean, it's chaotic, but it's slow and chaotic. We don't think about things like the erosion of public health, and the inability for lots of people to get dental care. And that's a huge symbol of a disintegrating society, especially if at one time dental care was more readily available. And you can think about our own society. There are still people. There's going to be some event that happens, and America's going to fall apart. It doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, you could say America is disintegrating in different ways in different places. And again, it's not some major event. It's sort of just slow breakdown. A slow worsening in services, for instance. Things like this that just happen, not immediately. Sorry, I made a note about something I needed to say. So, this comes from her Earth seed. All successful life is adaptable, opportunistic, tenacious, interconnected, and fecund. Understand this. Use it. Shape God. So remember, she believes God is change, meaning that we can shape the change. We can change the world in ways that we might not think of. I teach a political sociology class, and next week we're talking about civil war, and there's all these analyses that show the United States meets a lot of the conditions for a civil war. However, it's up to people to prevent that from happening, and there's it's not like set in stone that there's going to be a civil war, a second civil war in the United States, despite what the data says. A lot of data would have suggested that apartheid in South Africa, the segregationist system, would not have come down without armed struggle, without a civil war. And all the conditions were there, but that's not what happened. So I think it's very important to be aware of that. So again, kind of connecting the two things. What is liberalism, openness, freedom? all of that, what does that mean if the society's institutions are crumbling, or physically we're having crumbling infrastructure and things like that? These are big questions, and we'll return to them in class. All right, everyone, that's about all my brain can do today because of the fracking operation in my head. So use this time to, I guess, catch up on the readings, or finish your homework, play with your dog, or whatever it is that you need to do. All right, everyone, have a good week, and I will see you in class on Monday.